Story 1. Life After Death. When I was 19, my best friend was diagnosed with stage 4 ovarian cancer. We knew her cancer was terminal and she had a life expectancy of 5 years at most. Her and I would talk every now and then about passing on and how even though I was healthy, I could always go before her in a car crash or some other way. We made a pact that no matter which one of us left first, we would come back to the other and let them know that there was more to life after death. She eventually passed away from her illness at 22 years old, leaving behind her husband and her 3-year-old son. She passed away on a Sunday at 8:20 a.m. I remember the call from her husband vividly. He asked me to bring her son to the hospital because she had passed away. That day was a complete blur. I couldn't find myself to come to the reality she was no longer with us. It all felt unreal. We were allowed to be with her for a few hours in her hospital room before she was taken away. But while we were there with her, I was in complete shock and my mind just couldn't process it. I didn't cry. Leaving the hospital was so strange. Because at the time I had no children and my life revolves around my work, my home and her. She lived a few minutes from my job at the time, so I would always leave work very early to see her, whether she was at home or the hospital. I loved her so much. I could never be away from her. So now knowing I had to go home and trying to process I would never see her again just threw my life for a spin. That night I couldn't sleep. I just kept trying to make sense of it all. In all honesty, I don't even remember the thoughts that were going through my head, but the feelings of loss and confusion were very prevalent in me. I couldn't sleep at all. But at around 3 in the morning, I felt the most beautiful and reassuring feeling I have ever felt. I felt what I can only describe as a warm hug take over me from head to toe, and I fell asleep. That night I had a dream. In my dream, I called her husband to let him know that she had written me a letter. He then tells me that it's funny because she left him a voicemail. He then asks me to read him the letter. So I read it to him. In this letter she tells us how thankful she is that we were in her life. She thanked us for taking care of her and loving her. She asks us to please watch over her son and that she is okay and is no longer in pain. She also tells us that we will be okay. As I finished telling him about the letter, my mom comes into my room and wakes me up. She asks me for pen and paper. I hand her a piece of paper I had and she starts to write. When she finishes she hands it to me saying she didn't know why but something told her to write this and give it to me. When I read the letter it was word for word what my best friend told me in my dream, and she signed it with her father's last name. Now my mom only knew her by her mother's last name. No one outside her close relatives and myself knew her father's last name, so I was very confused as to how she signed it with her father's last name. I asked why or how she wrote this. My mom didn't know. She just wrote. I explained to her about my dream and she was as surprised as I was. I immediately called her husband and I told him about the letter and my dream. He agreed they were all her words. My best friend came through with her promise. This made me a believer. I know there's more after death.
Story 2. I used to give haunted tours of an old town. I used to be a tour guide in a popular tourist town in Tennessee. My job at the time was to take people on a circuitous 2-mile walk around the town, telling them the ghost stories of the people who had lived there. During the summer, tours started a little before sundown and would end well after dark. All in all, it would take us roughly 1 to 2 hours to get through a tour, depending on the walking speed of my group. Just to preface this, the vast majority of stories we told were not true. They were either largely exaggerated, entirely fabricated, or simply gruesome stories of local murders with a paranormal twist added at the end with the ghost of the killer still lurking about. I didn't write the script, don't blame me. In fact, I visited a local museum and sourced authentic ghost stories from a curator in order to add a few of my own to the tour which were actually authentic. That said, there were a handful of times during my stint as a tour guide in which I had experiences that were not so easily explained. In this post, I'm going to detail 3 of the most interesting ones. First story. One of the tools we got for our tours were EMF detectors, which I'm sure you're mostly all familiar with. They're intended to scan for electromagnetic frequencies, and will detect the relative strength of a signal they pick up. Now, Just because one of these things goes off doesn't mean you're seeing a ghost. They also pick up power lines and will go off like crazy near a generator. But if you're in the middle of nowhere and you suddenly get a strong signal, it's worth looking into. Now these detectors we used had about 5 lights on them, changing in hue from green to yellow to red. Red meant no signal, and green indicates a strong signal. The light never goes below red unless you turn the thing off, that's the baseline. At the end of our tour, we would come to an old graveyard, nobody buried there in at least 100 years. After I did my thing with the final story, people would wander around and look at the graves with flashlights and scare themselves shitless. But one night as they were wandering, a man called me over to see one of the graves. I went over and had a look, and saw what the problem was. Whenever he passed his EMF detector over this particular grave, all the lights would turn off. The entire machine would turn itself off when it was over this grave, and turn back on as soon as you moved it away. We tried with a couple other graves, but only this one had the effect. We were curious about the grave, so we tried to read the name of the person, but the headstone was too worn down for us to read it. The first name Thomas was faintly able to be read, but the surname was too hard to read. We had the whole group, 5 people, leaning over it at this point trying to read it, when we all heard the same thing. As one of the group wondered aloud what the man's surname was, a loud voice from behind us shouted, "Whaley." As you may have guessed, there was nobody behind us when we turned around, and we called the tour to a close shortly after that. I never messed with that specific grave again, except to place some flowers on it one time, as was my habit every once in a while, since nobody visited that place anymore. Second story. At the end of the tour, sometimes I would get tips if people had fun, got spooked. Older boomer and Gen X men really enjoy the charade of the covert handshake tip, where they palm you the money as they shake your hand. I always indulged the bit, because hey, I was getting a tip. One tour I ran had a family of 3, mother, father, daughter, and an older man who I initially thought was grandpa, but later learned had been lumped into their group because we didn't run solo tours. The old guy was pretty quiet throughout the tour, but would occasionally ask very pointed questions that stood out to me as odd. I don't remember most of his questions anymore. This was years ago. But one example is that I was telling a story of a girl who fell from a balcony and her ghost haunts the river she plummeted into to this day. And he asked me if I thought she died right away when she hit the ground, or whether I thought she died slow and suffered. Just weird things like that. Well, at the end of the tour, the family took off into the graves to have a look about, see if ghosts would show up in their pictures, etc. Old man came to give me that typical handshake, and mentally I was thinking that all his weird behavior could be easily forgotten if he tipped well. The handshake was normal except that his hand was ice cold, but old folks have cold hands, so I didn't think about it too much. Except he didn't palm me $1, he palmed me a coin. I thought it was a $50 when I felt it at first, but it was too big. I turned to glance at the guy as he walked past me to leave, and I shit you not, he was just gone. The path leaving the graveyard was downhill and you had visibility from the top for at least 300 feet. There was no way he could have covered that distance in that time, and I didn't even hear running. Just this old, tottering man in front of me 1 second and gone in the blink of an eye when he walked past me. When I got home and looked up the coin, I learned it was a 1 troy ounce silver bullion. Minted to an older year, I don't remember exactly. I can check the year when I get home this evening if anyone cares. Overall, the experience left me a little shocked, and the family agreed he was really odd when I walked them back to their car. Apparently, the guy greeted their daughter by name when they arrived at the meetup spot a few minutes before me, but they had no idea who he was. Story 3. So 2 weird experiences, but no ghostly apparitions or demonic screams. Unfortunately, most nights on the ghost tour were entirely mundane. However, I have got one more odd story I experienced which really set my belief of ghosts in stone. One of the earlier stops in our tour was an old cabin where the town's progenitor once lived. The cabin has been moved around a couple of times to build parking garages, but has since been placed back on its original spot. We don't actually have a photo of the woman who founded the town, but we have got pictures of her granddaughter, who everyone at the time swore was a dead ringer for her grandmother. Because of this, an old black and white photo of her granddaughter is on the sign outside the cabin. The cabin is kept locked up with a padlock at all times except when the Historical Society opens it up for school groups. The windows are so dirty you can't see inside, and most of the time it's too dark to get a decent look inside anyway. Regardless, I like to encourage people to peek through the cracks in the old wood because they'd psych themselves into thinking they saw something move, and a spooky tour is a tour with good tips. Anyway, one night after I did the whole spiel about her founding the town, and how people say they can see her ghost within the cabin on some nights to this day, I let them all have a go at peeking inside. One of the younger teens in the group approached me after looking inside, and we had a very odd conversation. These kids, 13 to 16, usually think it makes them cool to be skeptical and show everyone they're not scared. So he asked me something like, "Who's in the costume?" I was a little confused and explained how the photo on the sign is a picture of the granddaughter of the town's founder, but that she wasn't wearing a costume, that was how people dressed at the time. The little shit rolled his eyes and told me he meant the woman in the cabin. Of course I had to have a look, so I peeked through, and sure enough, a street light was shining through the dirty windows and letting in a diffused sort of light, and you could just make out a figure in a rocking chair sitting in the corner of the dark cabin, rocking back and forth. It was hard to get a good look at her, but from what I saw, she did look just like the woman in the photo. I moved the group on pretty fast because quite frankly, I was a little afraid it was a homeless person who'd broken in somehow. If it was, I had a group of 6 kids and 1 parent, homeschoolers I think. I didn't want anybody getting hurt or snatched. But I stopped by the cabin again on the way to my car, and the lock was on tight and undamaged. I peeked inside again, and there wasn't even a rocking chair in the cabin. In the whole time I worked the tour route, roughly 2 years, I never saw a chair in that cabin again. Or any old women, for that matter. I moved the group on pretty fast because quite frankly, I was a little afraid it was a homeless person who'd broken in somehow. If it was, I had a group of 6 kids and 1 parent, homeschoolers I think. I didn't want anybody getting hurt or snatched. But I stopped by the cabin again on the way to my car, and the lock was on tight and undamaged. I peeked inside again, and there wasn't even a rocking chair in the cabin. In the whole time I worked the tour route, roughly 2 years, I never saw a chair in that cabin again. Or any old women, for that matter. 4th story. At one point in the tour, we go down a set of stairs and walk a little trail by a river. This is the river where the girl fell in that the strange man was so curious about. The trail hits a dead end, so we have to double back and go back up the stairs in order to continue with the tour. Sometimes people are down there fishing. I don't think it's legal in that spot, but it doesn't stop them. The woman who trained me on the tours had a lot of joint pain, and so she would go down here after tours to soak her feet in the cold river water. She retired, but I took up her habit and would stop by there sometimes before returning home and enjoy the quiet. Now, most folks don't fish at night, but every once in a while I would have some company down there. For the most part, they minded their business and I minded mine. Sometimes we'd have a brief chat, but no in-depth conversations. One night I was down there soaking my feet, and it was a night where I had a fisherman as company. I think the guy was homeless, he had a lot of bags with him, but that didn't bother me any. I figured he was fishing for some dinner. I had sort of zoned out, staring at the water, when I noticed he had moved a lot closer. From maybe 30 featuring away to about 7 or 8. I thought I'd make my presence known in case he didn't notice me because he was too intent on his fishing. Asked something like, "They biting tonight?" or some other lame stereotypical small talk. As soon as I asked, he took that as an invitation to join me. Sat on the rock next to me and said he sees me walking by some nights. I explained my job to him and this got him talking about his own ghost stories. He told me that he's certain there's a ghost that hangs around by the riverside. He said he sees it when he's fishing and talks to it sometimes, but he knows it's a ghost because it never catches anything. Weird story, and it didn't really make any sense to me, but whatever. Live and let live. After a while he got bored of the conversation and fucked off somewhere. I chilled out for maybe another 10 minutes before I started to get cold. Dude forgot his fishing rod, so I picked it up thinking maybe I could find him and get it back to him, but he was long gone. I went back down to put it where he had been in case he came back for it, and I noticed that it didn't even have a line. It was literally just a rod with no line or hook. He was probably just out there and fucking with me, but it sure reminded me of his story of a ghost that never caught anything. Too easily explainable to call it paranormal, but definitely weird. 5th story. On the night this happened I had 2 tours in a row. This gets more common the closer you get to October because we start having more tours booked than we can facilitate. So the first one would run from about 8 o'clock to 9 o'clock or 9:30, and the second one would end sometime around 10:30 or so usually. I always offered to walk my tours back to their cars afterward. The city's pretty safe, but it's confusing in the dark. However, it does have a nightlife, and sometimes they would decline because they wanted to hit a bar afterward or keep exploring the cemetery. I'd let them do as they pleased, so if they weren't interested in going back with me, I'd make the walk back alone. This was one of those times, and it was for a later tour which had run over, so it was probably around 10:45 when I started walking back to my car. It's a lonely walk through some pretty looking, but odd areas of town to get from the cemetery to the parking garage that I knew wouldn't check your ticket. I bought one ticket and just used it over and over again. So I was on my way back for what would normally be a 15 to 20 minute walk, and everything seemed totally normal to me until I got in the car. When I got in and started it up, I glanced at the clock, and it was 12:01. I double-checked my phone, 12:01. I have no idea how I turned a 15 to 20 minute walk into over an hour. I thought maybe I left the tour later than I had thought, but I always texted my boss when the tours were over so she knew to mark me as clocked out. Check the text, 10:47.
Thanks for watching. Let us know your thoughts in the comments section, and please like and subscribe to help support the channel.